So, no, I don't work for Cisco. Let me say that again. I don't work for Cisco. I work for 1Password. Thank you all for being here. All right. Well, we need a clicker.
I have a clicker.
You have a clicker? Okay, yeah. I'm drunk with power now.
Yeah.
All right.
Or just drunk. Yeah.
Well, that was... Actually, yes. So, yes, thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure to be able to be back here again. I do love any opportunity I have to come back to Dublin and to be able to talk about, topics that are near and dear to our hearts. And for me, this is the first time ever co-presenting, and I'm really happy to be able to co-present with Rich.
And I hope I'm happy to be able to co-present with Dave. Ask me in about 30 minutes.
Well, yeah, we'll see how that all goes. So I've been doing this for about 30 years in the security field, co-owner of a whiskey distillery, football club, things to that effect, and
I'm not exciting. I don't own any whiskey. I do drink whiskey, but I've been also in the industry for coming up on 30 years now in a variety of roles. And I have a cute dog. That's the more important part.
So we've been into hacking for quite some time, and it's really interesting how for the longest time people saw that in a very negative context. And, we want to think about things that are positive, so I'm going to point out that I'm Canadian.
I have really no excuse or anything to say about my nationality right now.
We kind of feel like this guy.
Yeah,
a little bit. So one of the things I really do enjoy is being able to give talks like this around the world and have these conversations, but really talking about stuff that is going to make sense when we look at it through a different lens. We keep talking about data breaches. We keep talking about security issues. We keep talking about freaking passwords. And we were talking about a lot of the issues that we talk about today 30 years ago when I got into this field. And yet we're still having the same conversation. Now, Nassim Taleb, he wrote this book called Black Swan, and it was really looking at, how we can talk about events that are of massive impact, but in hindsight could have been easily predicted. Now, we take that, and he was talking about market issues and, global events. When we take that, we apply that against cybersecurity issues. So how many times have we seen a data breach where we're like, oh, yeah, we could easily fix that, and yet we're still here having this conversation? NotPetya was one of the many examples. This was a destructive issue that was far worse than it appeared to be. And we keep seeing all of these data breaches that keep coming up over and over and over again. WannaCry was a really amazing example because this was using a vulnerability. How old was that vulnerability?
Years.
Yeah, over a decade. It was a known issue, and yet it still became a problem. Then we talk about SolarWinds.
That had been hiding in there for... Years.
Again? Colonial Pipeline. The attackers went after an IT system that, for some reason, when it went offline, it took off the means of production. Bit of an issue. And then, hotels, which are always an easy target. Now, the one thing is with a Black Swan event, it's like an unpredictable event that has massive impact that could have been, in hindsight, easily fixed. But were they unpredictable? No, they weren't. A lot of the times, it is things that we have been talking about for 3 decades that could have been remedied. But we keep chasing after the next shiny thing. And the impact of these events can be very, very significant. And when we see this through the context of dealing with cybersecurity, this is painful to us. It should be painful to everyone that we keep running face first into a belt sander.
And part of it is the whole story of the Black Swan is that nobody could conceive of this until they discovered the Black Swan. And when we look at these unpredictable events, as Dave was saying, we can't predict when these things are going to happen. And we can't predict exactly what they're going to look like. But we can get a sense, we know from the broad scope of what's coming up. So, for example, with the SolarWinds attack, that was a supply chain attack. Who here has heard of the XZ attack, where basically we think it was Chinese espionage agents, became part of an open source, spent 2 years becoming part and then taking over as a maintainer, and then injecting very sophisticated malicious code upstream to a code library that was in most of your organizations. And do we think that that's the only Chinese agent that went ahead and has carried out an attack like that? The odds are very, very high that we already have the roots of other versions of that embedded within our organizations. So the problem is we know these events are going to appear. But what we don't know is exactly what they're going to look like. And that's the challenge for us at security. By the way, like the ChatGPT just hit out in the park on this one. This was like the first prompt this came up. It was like, I was very happy. I'm giggling and I'm texting it to Dave and then hoping he would respond. So what are other areas where we have to deal, we know things are going to hit us that we can't fully characterize? And in my experience, I draw from the world. So I'm a disaster response paramedic. And I'll go a little more into that for a while, but I've been a paramedic longer than I've been in information security. And I've been involved in a lot of these events. And one of the things that we rely on is ICS. ICS stands for the Incident Command System, not Industrial Control Systems. And the entire idea of ICS is that you should be able to respond to anything and everything that's thrown at you. As a paramedic, I'm not a chaos agent, I'm a chaos tamer. That's what we do. I don't have nearly the medical knowledge of a physician or of a nurse or of all of these other things. But when something really bad happens, we know how to manage that environment and manage that scene because we have developed systems to do it. From this event, which was entirely unpredictable. This was a rescue I was on years ago when I was doing mountain rescue, where it was a ski resort and the avalanche slid down the road, trapped 300 people at a ski resort that had no overnight facilities during a blizzard, and it was so unsafe we had no way to get anybody else in there. And so it was, 2-3 days later when I got flown in on a helicopter to help evacuate people. We had never responded to anything like this. In fact, that same storm, we were running avalanche searches for collapsed homes because there was 10 feet of snow that had collapsed some of the roofs in a couple of areas. Or when I responded to Hurricane Hurricane Katrina. I also responded to Hurricane Mariah. Hurricane Katrina, where this is a picture I took from the inside of the sports facility in Houston where we took all of these evacuees. And that one, I assume, made the news globally because it was just an incredible collapse. And there was no way to predict everything there. In fact, our team was kind of thrown out the door last minute. And so how do we handle these things? Because you can't predict. Because when I responded to Hurricane Katrina, at one point I was sent out because we had 6 people on my team that had gone off comms. So we were in an area, their cell phones weren't working, there were too many cell phone people, they weren't responding to the radio calls. So I got sent out with a police officer to find him. We find him in a parking lot. The next thing we know, 7 of us triaged 900 patients in 3 hours. Because somebody just started directing the buses from New Orleans to that parking lot, pulling people out of the buses. So we have systems for triage. They're not meant for 900 patients coming off of buses in 3 hours. But we did it because it's all about having a system and having a process and series of systems and processes to be able to respond and to be able to account for the unknown, for this chaos, for new situations that we've never encountered before. Because even on an average paramedic shift back in my youth when I was working on the ambulance, I didn't know exactly what I was going to encounter. They'd call us and send us out for somebody with a head injury, and I'd see a decapitation. I don't have to do much on those, actually. There's like certain problems that kind of solve themselves. So, look, if the person goes into cardiac arrest, then I just get to do CPR. It's much easier than actually figuring out what's wrong. Dark humor now?
Little bit dark. Little dark.
Okay, a little bit dark. And so one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time doing the past years, particularly because I teach cyber incident response at Black Hat for cloud incident response, is I've become fascinated with, can we take those systems and methodologies and apply them to what we do in this domain? Can I pull from the disaster response and the paramedic and the firefighter work and take those systems and translate them over? Because it is different what we do in cyber. And this is an example of taking a framework which is known as the Advanced Medical Life Support. I can't even remember what the exact call of it was on there. And then, how does that apply? For example, and the one I did here is when you go into a new organization, you're the new CISO security director, and it's a big mess. How do you start? How do you clean that out? Because that is a form of chaos. That is a disaster event for the individual, even if that disaster has been burning for the 15 years that company has existed. And I think we can take the lessons from these systems, and we are able to apply those and expand out. Because look, for incident response, what do we have? Everybody knows is it the NIST and the SANS? It's prepare, detect, respond, analyze. I should know this because I teach classes, and apparently I'm not a very good instructor at any of this kind of stuff. But, we have some of those, but does that help us? How does that bridge from that single incident responder who's seeing that event all the way up to the CEO of a company? Let me give you an example. A couple weeks ago, I got a call from a client I had just started working with because they realized somebody had locked them out of one of their accounts. They do data analytics work. Very quickly, they realized they got locked out because there was a compromise and an incident. And in the end, it was hundreds of millions of records got exposed as part of this incident. Small company, not a lot of resources, no dedicated security. Like, I was coming in to help them learn how to do security or to help do an assessment of their program. And immediately, I went into my paramedic mode. So how can I help them? Because this now is not an isolated incident. This is not the single responder, the tech guy who called me because he saw that they had a service account get locked out because somebody tried to put multi-factor authentication on it. And it was falling back on these skills and these processes to grow that up, to expand out and to be able to adapt for that new kind of situation. Because we have formalized frameworks. This is from the training called ICS 300, Incident Command System 300. It's called the Planning P, and it's all about building an operational cycle. You set an operational cycle usually for 24 hours. And in that operational cycle, you have specific goals and specific metrics and measurements and specific desired outcomes that come on the other side. And you just keep rotating through that and rotating through that through the incident. Because I constantly responded to different kinds of things I've never done before. And we fall back on our algorithms, and that's what we call it. We've got the algorithms, we've got the systems, and we have the protocols to deal with things. From those small incidents up to the global ones, like my client who is now having to coordinate with law enforcement and lawyers and forensics firms from a variety of other companies that were affected by this as it expands out. In the United States, we have something called the National Incident Management System. And this was developed after Katrina and after 9/11. Those were two of the reinforcing events. And we have an actual framework for incident response that goes all the way to the first police officer, firefighter, or paramedic that shows up on scene, all the way up to the executive branch. And we've even trained exercises, not a lot of them, where we have stressed the entire system of all the different agencies and everything else coming together. And it's on guiding principles, a shared language for communication. We're supposed to use plain English, not 10 codes or anything else, so everybody knows where everybody is talking about. A consistent organization structure, so you can start plugging in the Lego bricks as different teams and as different capabilities are needed. And the reality is that we in the cyber community are becoming part of this, because the kinds of incidents that we're dealing with the actual other ICS and operational technology and major breaches that can take down banks and hospitals, when there's a ransomware attack on a hospital, that is no longer something for a few cyber incident responders to deal with. That affects entire local communities and hospital systems and engages disaster plans. And so we're these resources. When there's the big hurricanes, we just had some. If you watch the news, you'll often see a couple of things. And one of the things you'll see is a stream of trucks from power companies that aren't from that region, that are pulled from all over the country because they know the power infrastructure is going to go out. Do you think a lineman at a power company has emergency medical training and ICS training like I do? No, but they're plugged into this specific system that is designed to deal with these chaotic events. And there's some that are wild. So a few years ago, it was during COVID, when we had a problem with unaccompanied minors at the U.S. border. So it's not broadly known, but the Coyotes is the name of the criminal underground that will help people come into the United States. They will sometimes backlog and hold everybody on the other side. And then they'll release them all at once in one area to stress the system so they can transport drugs in another area. It's not a thing they do all the time, but this was one of those events. I was never trained on how to deal with 14 to 15-year-old boys that had migrating up from like Nicaragua and Guatemala. Or like the one boy we had who came from some tribal area and nobody spoke his language. This wasn't part of our system. Within 3 days, we had stood up a camp for these kids. We were providing medical care and vaccines and evaluations and family reunification because we used this system. I was working with the Center for Disease Control, Health and Human Services. So there's all of these other agencies, and we all plugged in piece by piece. And all of our roles and situations changed. And a lot of the ICS stuff originally came for wildfires. We have bad ones. And when those wildfires hit, they always start small with a local agency and then get all the way up to the federal level. And federal teams are flown in to deal with these kinds of things. So that's the magic and the power of having just a framework and a basis and a system and the training. And it's one that we in the cyber community globally are having to become more involved with as the nature of attacks bridge into our physical world.
And it's really frustrating when we look at this and we see these defined repeatable processes that work in those events. I mean, yes, you could not think of these catastrophic events that come up, but yet they still happen. And when we apply that in the cybersecurity realm, we realize that it is not nearly, well, hopefully, is not going to be nearly the same impact as we're going to see with some of these events.
Some of those hospital outages already are at that level.
Well, there was the one in 2022 in Dusseldorf where they had lost control of their systems due to a ransomware event. And there was a patient that was inbound, and they could not admit the patient to the hospital because all of their systems were offline. There was no manual process. And as a result, they redirected that ambulance to another hospital 41 kilometers away. Unfortunately, the patient didn't make it. And that was the first, I think, actual documented case where cybersecurity incident response
resulted in a fatality.
So how do these bad things keep happening? A lot of times, it's just something as simple as a password. And this is one of those absolute frustrations that I have because we've been having the same conversation for 30 plus years. And we want to look at it as like, how do we improve things overall? There are better ways to do authentication. There's multi-factor authentication. There's biometrics, love it or hate it. There's all sorts of different ways. But we have to move beyond the simple password. A house key is fantastic when you lock your flat, go off for the day, and your stuff is safe. But if somebody's able to find that key and they know it's yours, and I use this analogy in pretty much every talk I ever give, it is just that simple. We have to find a better way to secure our stuff. Because bad things is going to happen. Bad things are going to happen. There's the Guinness catching up with me. So, for example, here in this particular group, at a previous company I worked at, we tracked organizations like this where they would actually go around compromising websites, and then the credentials they were purloining, they would then use against other websites to increase their ability to get bad English.
It's fine. He's Canadian. English is his third language.
Yep. I need maple syrup. And in this particular case, this was a $71 million operation, and it was just a few people. But these sort of operations happen around the world. And we have to understand that they are successful because bad things happen. When I was in the other ICS, did 9 years in control systems.
By the way, we had a whole conversation when I was pitching this idea for Dave and I as we were planning this. And I'm saying ICS, and he's nodding his head. And he had no idea what I was talking about.
Not a clue.
He was industrial control systems. What does this have to do with black swans?
I'm lucky I have pants on today. Let's be honest.
So are we.
So in this particular story, I was working for a power company, and we had this weird ARP storm going on the network, and we couldn't for the life of us figure it out. And we were going through all the system logs, everything, and something just didn't make sense. And I took the tile lifter, I walked out onto the raised floor because I was done trying to figure it out. So first tile up, nothing. Second tile up, nothing. Third tile. Staring back at me was a Cisco router that nobody knew about. It was under the floor. So our company, which was a small power company, was originally part of a much larger company that was broken up into 5 separate organizations. One of those organizations was ostensibly a direct competitor of ours, and this router was connecting the two companies still. Thankfully, our compatriots on the other side had no idea this was there either, and it was a very terrible incident, but that's just it. It's like we keep having these issues pop up. Something as simple as this, where it could have had a catastrophic impact. If there was some sort of malware event on our side or conversely the other side, it could have spread across and we would have been none the wiser as how that happened. And a lot of times it's because, security folks, we tend to follow our own set of rules and we have to make sure that we are doing a better job of this. We have to have those defined, repeatable processes that we can apply to situations that, yes, we may not have thought that. We have to go through and understand the modern landscape has changed. The attackers are still there. They're still causing havoc, but the impact of these events has raised up. This is one of those slides that I love using over and over again. And this is a site called informationisbeautiful.net. They do data visualization, and these are data breaches. Back in 2012, the biggest one that I could find at the time was 6.9 million records. We're now dealing with data breaches in the magnitude of 1 billion plus. And it's so much so that we're sensibly desensitized to it now, which is terrifying. One of the reasons these things happen is because of, the whoopses, like the router under the floor, or something as simple as shadow IT. Now,
I hate that term.
He hates that term.
By the way. Okay, let's be real. We call it shadow IT like it's the employees doing bad things. Shadow IT is employees doing things with tools that we have not provided them to get their jobs done. They're not putting their credit cards out there because they want like a personal Salesforce.com account or something like that, or a new marketing site. It's just that we haven't enabled them in the ways that we need to.
100% agree with you. And that's just it. They are parts of the business trying to get things done, but they don't have the necessary support, or they don't think they have the necessary support in order to get that job done. The problem here is that when these shadow IT projects spin up, they introduce risk into the organization. And the attackers know this because, they're not being properly managed by, IT security, whatever it happens to be, and then the exposures happen. And then the attackers come. So you have security debt in a lot of cases that's built up, that's technological debt that has become a security issue, and along comes ransomware. Now, in this particular slide, if you look over here on the right side of the slide in 2023, the smaller bubbles indicate, SMB, small business, small, medium business. And the attackers have really shifted over time from going after large targets because large companies tend to have better resource pools. And the attackers know that they can get roughly the same sort of revenue from the smaller businesses.
Some of these smaller organizations are working with the data from these large companies. They have hundreds of millions and billions of records and all of this information because they're doing something, especially now as we're going to AI and data analytics. A lot of that is being pushed to these small firms that don't have the resources of the big ones. They're going after the hospitals not because they want to kill people. They're going after the hospitals because they know they're under-resourced. And if they shut a hospital down, somebody is going to pay the ransom because that's a critical system and that can't stay down.
Exactly. And in the case of the Dusseldorf hospital, the attackers thought they were going after the university because it was a university hospital. They weren't paying attention. That was their story.
Missed it by that much.
That much. Unfortunately, there was a cost. And when those little whoopses happen, we have to really understand how to pivot and fix this. Like back in 2019, this is a Capital One case where it was a misconfigured WAF, and that led to 100 million credit cards being exposed. Uber, back in 2016, they had a GitHub repository that was compromised, and that was 57 million users. And good old Dow Jones, an Amazon S3 bucket. Now, I always use this. It's a very simple example, but it's one that people understand. An S3 bucket, if you're not familiar with it, is a data repository you can spin up through a web interface, get it going, and you can put whatever you want into it.
Amazon has a customer incident response team. They're a CSIRT, and they work with customers who have dealt with various breaches. And the statistic that they released at somebody at AWS, it's from a presentation, so it's not like in a blog post or anything. 66% of what they respond to is exposed credentials, static credentials, an access key and a secret key. If you work a lot with AWS, you're not really supposed to use those. I build entire environments without ever using them, but they're in wide use. 13% of those are what's known as root account credentials, which is basically ring zero for your cloud deployment. And when you add in everything else, I think up to 79%, the total is things being exposed to the public. Just they make the data public because it's a misconfiguration. And going back to what Dave was saying about the passwords before and the techniques in the authentication, we have known about the problem with access keys for 13 of the 15 years I've been doing cloud. I screwed up over 10 years ago and exposed one. I did a whole big blog post. We know about this. Amazon tells you not to use them, but we still keep having these repetitive issues.
I wrote an article years ago on Forbes about these S3 buckets as example, and it says right on the interface, do not make this public unless you absolutely know what you're doing. Unfortunately, when it's a shadow IT project that's being spun up, it's not necessarily anybody with a security mindset. And these problems keep happening. In one organization that I worked at, we went through, in the first couple of weeks I was on the job, we did a review of all of those root level accounts to see what was going on in the environment. And when we went through that, we found that 10 of the accounts that were in the system were root level that were still enabled, but those people didn't work at the company anymore. Now, we went through that, and we found that one of those accounts had been used in the last 2 years. And I always use this example because it's so poignant. This was a real problem. Can anybody can anybody guess, let's try that a better, why this account was such a big deal? So it had been used in the last 2 years by somebody that wasn't there anymore. Sorry? Oh, okay, no worries. I thought you were jumping in there.
Don't make eye contact with Dave.
Yep, no, don't see him.
Lesson learned.
That person had been dead for 5 years. So somebody in the organization was using this account. When we tracked it all down, we were able to find out that they weren't actually doing anything bad, but hope is not a strategy. You want to make sure that you understand what is in your environment. You want to make sure you're tackling unmanaged devices, unmanaged services, accounts that should have been dealt with a long time ago. So how do we go forward? We have to look at things like zero trust architecture. Love it or hate it, it's about risk reduction, fundamentally at the core of it. You want to look at continuous authentication verification, microsegmentation. I used to not be a fan of that, but as I get older, I'm realizing...
Yeah, it works.
It works, absolutely. Extended access management, looking for those unmanaged devices and getting them managed properly within your environment. And the rise of cyber insurance is something that's been very interesting because I see more and more organizations are relying on this, but understand that's not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
So my client who had an issue, they actually had cyber insurance, and that is the saving grace. Is it going to protect them from all the losses and lost business and all of those issues? No. Is it paying for the forensics firm? Is it paying for the response process? Yes. And when the incident occurred, one of the very first things I said is call your lawyer. They always have cyber insurance. Call them and use whatever response firm they tell you to use. So they're going to cover the charges. I have been negative on cyber insurance for 20 years. I now believe that it is much more valuable than I had previously thought.
But also understand that if you're not doing your security program well, that the insurance is not going to pay out. Great example of this is one power company I was working at. We had a KVM room, which was keyboard, video, mouse. You go and sit there if you don't want to do any changes on your production systems. So we would go into this room. It was windowless. It was lifeless. I hated going into this room. And I kept saying, is there a better way we can do this? Can we just put a crash card on the system out on the floor? And they're like, no, we got to do it this way. So one day, me being me, I went back to my desk and I was like, I wonder if they have RDP set up. Because a lot of other silly things that happen in our environment, and I was able to RDP into all of my systems from my desk. This was pure security theater. There was no network zone segmentation. There was no anything like that. It was do not look behind the curtain. The Great Oz commands it. So in your environment, you have to look at problems differently. One of the things that comes up is the 10th person rule. If you have 9 people that say, this is not going to be a problem, everything's fine, the job of that 10th person is to say, yeah, no, it is a problem, and here's why, and document that. Because you need to start looking at things differently. We have to look at, defined repeatable processes that are going to reduce risk. Because as with events in real life and cybersecurity, they are going to happen time and again. And we can't just keep saying that they are unpredictable.
If you think about what Dave and I are talking about here, it's two sides of a coin. About preparing so that you're in a position to reduce the impact and the likelihood of these events and focusing on the fundamentals. That's what he's been talking about there. I also have a philosophy that simple doesn't scale. So even though we're not trying to tell you these things are easy to do at scale in these larger organizations, there will be gaps and there will be holes. And that's where being prepared to manage those and to have that process and to be able to scale that process. So there's a wide range of things that we're talking about here. Everything from smaller incidents like the router under the floor all the way up to hospital systems and other critical systems going down. And these are all things that you can build your systems and your processes and your methodology and you can train for. And as cybersecurity professionals, we have the fundamentals of this. We do a lot of this. And now it's making sure that we're able to scale it up to deal with the wide range and the new kinds of incidents that we can predict as well as the ones that we can't.
Cool. Thank you very much for your time today. I realize we're at time and won't be able to take any questions, but if you want, you can always email us, and we'd be more than happy to field any questions that way.
Thank you.